works. My entire life, since the age of 12 up until now, I've always worked in a small business, all the time. When I worked at a deli, it was a small shop of 2 owners, 2 Greek immigrants, 2 owners, and they taught me the value of hard work. And every year that I worked there, as a kid stacking newspapers, all the way up until I was going into college, they emphasized hard work. And they always increased the people who worked in the deli based on how much money they brought in and whether or not Mount Vernon increased their taxes, or the state of New York increased their taxes. So these 2 Greek immigrants taught me the value of business. If the taxes are low and less regulation in the business, then they're going to hire more people, quote unquote, and hire more of my friends. Because as everyone knows, in a small business, it's nepotism. You hire your friends and everyone else grows. That's how this economy works. Less taxes, less regulation, and our economy will grow. That's how it works. We have to 100% repeal Obamacare. It's a travesty that that law is out there. And it's not only saying it, it means going to Washington, D.C. and saying every day, walking the corridors and convincing everybody there, and that's my job as your servant, to go there and say, I want your vote to repeal Obamacare now. And when they say no, then my job, because I'm representing you, is to say, why not? And continue to sit down with them, not to reform government, to repeal this ridiculous bill. And as a servant of yours, that's what I'm going to do. Of course, I'm for making sure that Bush tax cuts do not expire. My opponent and I share the same philosophies regarding that. But what we have to do is we have to repeal this bill. And that means not suspending it until the unemployment rate hits 5%, like my opponent suggested, but going in there firmly and saying, this is where I stand, this is what I will accept, and that is only repealing. My opponent wants us to let that go, and when the economy goes down to 5%, and common sense tells you that's not going to happen anytime soon. It might be 2 or 3 years before we get down to 5%. So she's willing to have this bill out there until it goes below 5%. That to me says she is not fully on board of repealing this bill. I am telling you right now, every day that I walk those corridors, I will be convincing everybody to repeal that awful bill.
This question is generic in that it doesn't pertain to any particular, heading. As you know, the federal government didn't create the states created the federal government. You'll be serving, if you're successful, in the federal government. And the question, and Neil will go first on this one, what should the federal government stop doing, and what should the federal government start doing?
The federal government has to stop interfering and forcing us to buy Obamacare. That's the first priority that we have to look at. There's a long-term agenda that we all have as your leaders, and we want to focus on the future. But we have to understand that we are paying a heavy cost with Obamacare. This plan is not going to go in for a few years, but now, this is common sense. Ask all of your friends. Trust me, call them up and ask them if their premiums have risen at least by 20% in the last 3 months. Why? Because health care insurers want to make sure that they make as much money now before 2014 comes. And that affects your pocketbook now. We can't focus on something that's going to happen in 2030. We have to focus now on repealing Obamacare. That's the first thing we have to focus on when the new Congress goes into session in 2011, is to repeal this awful bill. If anyone tells you that there should be another agenda, then they're telling you a lie. We have to repeal this bill and stop the insurance companies from taking more money out of our pockets for no other reason but their own self-interest.
everybody's information, I have signed the repeal it pledge from the Club for Growth regarding the health care bill. So I'm myself, as I mentioned, fully supportive of repeal. If we have enough numbers, we will. If we don't, we're going to have to gradually defund and depower it and introduce solutions that work for the American people. With regard to what the federal government should stop doing, this federal government has to stop being ideology-driven. And that's the fundamental problem that we face right now. We have a president, an administration, and a Congress that clearly does not understand, do not understand, the arc and trajectory of American history. They do not understand that it is the citizen, the motivated citizen, and the private sector that power this country, that power the economy, that make us the greatest power in the free world, that make us the guarantor and beacon of freedom. So the first thing that this government has to stop doing is to stop being ideology-driven, empowering its own size and scope further, and start returning power to the citizens in the ways that I described in my previous answer, by stopping the spending, the reckless spending, the heedless spending that is building mounting debt that our children and grandchildren will never be able to repay, by allowing you and all of your fellow citizens to keep more of what you have labored for. And when we can institute a philosophy that empowers the citizen, then we will have done a very fine thing for the American people, and I intend to work tirelessly to make that happen. And in terms of what the federal government should be doing, what the federal government should be doing, of course, is in a way the converse of what we were just talking about. The federal government needs to believe in you, to have faith in you, as the founders and framers did. The federal government also needs, on a concrete note, to have a budget. This Congress has not even passed a budget. They've passed a raft of spending bills. They've passed a raft of incremental so-called stimulus bills for which they have no realistic plan to pay. So we need to have a full accounting, no more off-the-books items, a real idea, a sound idea of what's going out and what's coming in, and how we make that all smaller so that we can make the economic pie bigger by letting our private sector have the resources it needs to do what it can do with the freedom that the American people have always cherished.
All right, this question is actually very timely based on the fact that we're coming upon the 9/11 anniversary on Saturday. What do you believe are the most important steps that we can take towards assuring the short and long-term security of Americans both home and abroad?
There is a theme here, as we all know, and the theme is, for me, as a citizen and as a candidate to represent you in Congress and serve you in Congress, is that the greatest thing that we can do to secure our future, the greatest action that we can take in a Congress and collectively as citizens, is to have a thriving economy. The American economy was the engine of freedom in World War II, and both of my parents are World War II veterans. I mentioned that my mother is an immigrant. She served 4 years in the British Army, believe it or not in the combat role. But the reason that we defeated the Axis forces ultimately came down to the sweat of the American brow, which powered the rest of our allied forces, who were also doing all that they could, but they didn't have what we had. They didn't have the extraordinary liberties that we had, the extraordinary resources that we had. If we are to maintain our role, and that's part of our American exceptionalism, we have a unique role in securing the free world. We are the world's biggest target. We are the world's greatest power. We have benefited therefrom in many ways, but it carries with it a heavy responsibility. The greatest good that we can do for our national security is to ensure that the American economy is strong. We can face any foe if we are not in debt, if we have the resources we need to maintain a strong and unequivocal defense, and that means materiel and manpower and technology and intelligence, none of which are cheap, but they are worth it if we can maintain the freedoms that are so extraordinary and that the rest of the world has looked to and relied on through the centuries, especially in the 20th and 21st century. We have so many challenges to face. In fact, I was just at the September 11th site. We were at Ground Zero for a rally for Americans for Prosperity, and I passed the site of the mosque. And I think the reason, the proposed mosque, we were right in front of it, my son and I think the reason Americans are so shaken by it, by that issue, is because never in our lifetimes have we perceived that the threat comes not only from without, and that never changes, although I hope it will someday, we can have a more peaceful world, but also from within. We are weakening ourselves from within. If we do not free the American people from the burdens that this federal government is placing on them, we cannot maintain the free world and our own nation in strength.